Good afternoon, everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name's Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this conversation today on Balkan troubles, the European perspective and the case for U.S. engagement. We're delighted to be partnering with the European Fund for the Balkans for this event. And I want to give a special welcome first to our board director, Bob Gelbard, Ambassador Bob Gelbard, who throughout his career played a pretty fundamental role in the Balkans, but importantly for today has been one of the driving forces and the impetus on the Atlantic Council board for much of our work here in Washington and the region. We're also delighted to be joined by ambassadors from Albania, from Croatia, and at one point I saw them from Macedonia who are with us. As well as Ambassador Dan Freed, who played a pretty key role in developing policy over the years in this region. This event today is part of an expression, a renewed Atlantic Council commitment to the Balkans. And over the past year or so, we've had staff members, board members, delegations that have visited Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Kosovo. We're next to head to Albania, as the Albanian ambassador helpfully reminds us, although we did a special broadcast in Albania last month. But the premise of our work here on this has been that there's uncertainty right now in the core of the transatlantic community. There's uncertainty in the future of Europe, uncertainty even in the future of the United States and its role in the world. And when there's uncertainty in the center, that actually spells trouble for the periphery. And so the premise of a lot of what we're doing is that with a bit of strategy, a bit of attention, we can help actually shape and get things right in a region where we have deep and long investments. Alternatively, conversely, if we think we've got the luxury of disengaging, downplaying, and ignoring some of the issues in the region, what are problems have the potential to become major crises, demanding a surprising amount of political capital and attention from decision makers in Washington and Europe. And so I think this is a little bit of the focus of our programming, that there are consequences to inaction and consequences to action. And we're not just able to watch perhaps benign stagnation, but we're actually worried about what we see as backsliding and an opportunity as we step back potentially of other forces stepping in, whether it be Russia, which we'll talk about today, organized crime, foreign fighters, the refugee crisis. All of these issues come to a head in the Balkans. So today we want to be able to focus on a European panel, to listen to European commentators on this. After all, in many respects, we all expect a European lead and a lead from the region on these issues. But in recognition, we're having this conversation in the United States, in Washington, because of the catalytic role of the U.S. But I also hope we can draw out some of the European perspectives on the United States' role in the region as well. So we're pleased to be partnering with the European Fund for the Balkans. Hedvig Moravai was going to be with us, the executive director. She wasn't able to travel, so we're delighted to be joined by Igor Bandovich, who's the senior program manager at the fund. And before I introduce our panelists, let me invite Igor up to offer a word of welcome as our co-host.
Thank you. On behalf of the European Fund for the Balkans, I want to thank, first of all, Atlantic Council, and then Sarah and Damon for setting up this event for us. I will say just a few words on the work we are doing, why we are here, and what we actually do in the Balkans. I'm working for the European Fund for the Balkans, which is a joint initiative of 3 private European foundations: Bosch Foundation, Erste Foundation, and King Baudouin Foundation from Belgium. Basically, our aim, our role in the Balkans is to bring the Balkans closer to the EU through supporting public administration reform, policy development, regional cooperation, and really trying to consolidate liberal democracies in the region. Through our work, we are dealing with think tanks. We are supporting think tanks in the region very much. We are working with partners in the member states, and usually mostly in Brussels. And actually, this is our second time and second visit to the U.S. in the capacity of Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, which is our joint initiative between the Center for Southeast European Studies of the University of Graz and the fund. We gathered 3 years ago a group of 15 policy researchers, and basically what we are trying to do is to provide policy advice, policy recommendations, and policy opinions to the member states, EU institutions, but also to the governments of the region. We are very much working on the freedom of media, rule of law, and these are the core principles of our work. We are trying to push the reforms in the region through our, well, recommendations, conclusions, policy briefs, and I advise you to go to the site of our group, biepag.eu, and you can see our recent publications. Partly, the reason why we are here is really to promote two of them. One is on the crisis of democracy in the region, and the other one is on geopolitics. We don't have too many of the publications. I have only a few, but you can download it from our website. And we are really taking advantage of the moment here in the US, and we are this week here in order to really feel the momentum and to feel the sense what's going on in the US when it comes to the Balkans. Once again, thank you. I'm very encouraged to see so many people interested in the Balkans today. And thanks again, Atlantic Council, for hosting this event. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Igor. Let me go ahead and invite our discussants to join me on the stage. We've got Maida, Dima, Milan. Please come on up, Florian. I'll introduce you properly. First of all, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Igor. We're really delighted to dive into these set of issues with a terrific group of experts, folks that follow the details in the region far more closely than I do, and to engage many of you in the audience as well as our audience online in a conversation, I think, about what the two leading reports that the group has put out most recently about some of the geopolitics returning to the region, but also some of the democracy and issues at home. To do this, we've got Dr. Dimitar Beshev with us, who is the director of the European Policy Institute and is a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who also serves as one of our non-resident senior fellows in our Eurasia Center, focused on Russia and the Balkans, as well as other issues in Southeast Europe. Dr. Florian Bieber here, who is the director of the Center for Southeast Europe Studies at the University of Graz, and he's the coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. I'm doing this not in the order you're sitting, but in alphabetical order. And so Milan Nish, we're really delighted to have Milan Nish here, who has been active in our sister organization in Slovakia, but now serves as a senior fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and has also been a non-resident fellow as part of our Europe work here, focused on the Balkans at the Council. And Dr. Maida Ruga, who is not part of this delegation, but sort of joins the family based here in Washington. She's a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at SAIS at Johns Hopkins. But Maida shares something with Milan. They both joined the Atlantic Council delegation to the Balkans early this year. So we wanted to turn to our colleagues who have come to Washington for their thoughts to kick off. And I'll ask you to comment on some of these thoughts of how they look here from a perspective of someone from the region, but based here in Washington. So with that, let me start with you, Florian, if I might. We published just before this delegation came here, we published on the Atlantic Council website an article, a blog from some of the delegation members, including you, that starts off with political crises, regional tensions, and the decline of democracy point to an increased risk of conflict and instability in the Balkans. And as I mentioned to the group before gathering, we just a couple days ago hosted Senator John McCain with our Munich Security Core Group. And just back from the region, John McCain, speaking to a group of senior Americans and Europeans who don't particularly follow the Balkans, really warned them and said, you've not been paying attention. We collectively have not been paying attention to the region. We do that at our own peril. It is time that we focus on what's happening. because it could come back to bite us. So Florian, ground us. You've been working and paying attention in the region. You've just put out a couple of these reports. Ground us a little bit in the dynamics that you see playing out in the region right now.
Right. Thank you very much, Damon, for the question, also hosting us. I think the bottom line is that there is an increasing recognition that there is a crisis in the region brewing, that there is, if we don't pay attention, a kind of negative backsliding risking to happen. And I think what we have to kind of understand is what are the dynamics, why is it coming about? And we argue very strongly it's the decline of democracy in the region. Now, from that derive a lot of other phenomena, increased engagement of external actors in a destructive manner, increased ethnic tensions, decline in bilateral relations. But all of that is not the cause, but rather the effect. So we're seeing this kind of decline of democracy. And again, I'm not trying to say it happens in all countries in equal pace and equal extent, but we don't see progress over the last decade. And in some countries, quite serious backsliding. So we have kind of autocratic behavior, which invites in external actors, which invites also ethnic tensions and bilateral relations. And there are lots of examples for that. And of course, the most poignant case is the crisis in Macedonia, which has been about massive wiretapping, abuse of democratic procedures, which is basically making a regular democratic change of government very difficult at the moment. And that's, of course, the most dramatic example. But we've seen a lot of incidents, a lot of kind of micro crises, which point the direction where the region might be heading if the status quo persists. And I think what you said in the beginning, we can't believe that the status quo is sustainable, that if we just maintain things as they are, they'll be fine, but rather that the status quo is kind of heading in the wrong direction. It's kind of getting worse and worse in a kind of downward spiral. And that is, I think, where we have to be quite careful that a kind of more concerted, not even a major, but a more concerted, serious US-EU commitment can make a huge difference. But I guess we'll talk more about the kind of what we can do about it later.
I think that's right. That's right. Let me bring in Milan here, because in Washington, the Balkans was entering on the radar screen because our Senate had to deal with the issue of NATO enlargement to Montenegro. And one of the things the Atlantic Council did in partnering with our Slovak counterparts was really engaging in Montenegro to help address some of the misunderstandings of what membership really meant. But Milan, you've spent a lot of time in the region. So here we are poised in a little advertisement. It's June 5th. I think that we now know that the Montenegrins will deposit their protocols at the State Department. And on that day, when we're pleased to be celebrating our Distinguished Leadership Awards here in Washington, honoring Jens Stoltenberg, who will be here in Washington, to have a Montenegrin contingent to deposit those protocols on what is the exact day of the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. It sort of all comes together in quite a poignant story to point towards, wait a second, there is something positive, there is something going. What's the dichotomy? What's happening, Milan, from your perspective? We're just about to take the next step on enlargement in the region, and yet your group is here saying we've got a problem.
First of all, thank you for hosting us. And it's also very exciting to be in Washington, D.C., where Washington is in its own moment of uncertainty about your own government and presidency and so on and so on. So it's not easy to even discuss, to bring conversation on Western Balkans. Yet, coming back to your initial remarks, this is a fragile moment in fragile regions around Europe. My bet would be that if there is trouble and bloodshed down the road in coming weeks or months, it would not be Eastern Ukraine. It's likely to be Eastern Ukraine, but I would rather bet on countries like Macedonia, where the dynamics is really very bad, at the fringe of civil war maybe. And we have, as part of our group, Nikola Dimitrov, a former Macedonian ambassador to Washington here, maybe to tell you more about that later. But so why Balkans is important is because it's explosive and trouble might be there behind the corner. Number two, perceptions of US are very important there. And US was also engaged in NATO enlargement and finishing the whole enlargement case of Montenegro, which was the single most important element on the ground. If they would be if US would stumble on that, it would send the shock waves around. Now, you might have recalled that there was something happening around elections in Montenegro in October 2016 with Russians involved. It was more than Montenegro, and it was really an attempt to spell instability there, to maybe derail the whole ratification process in Montenegro membership in NATO. So what's the big picture? The big picture is that this is a post-war region. This is part of the post-war, post-Yugoslav war settlement there. You cannot walk out. You're part of it, and you are perceived by leaders there as the most credible and most important partner, more important than EU partners. So what you say here, it's really, it's being discussed, it's being watched there, and it's part of domestic politics. So therefore, signals that you are sending are from administration or from Senate or congressmen are really followed. So be aware of this in this fragile moment when, and my second point is, this is a super election year in Europe. So you have French elections, you will have German elections, you will have elections in a couple of other countries, and you have this moment of fragility around the world with Trump administration. So this is where, I mean, I hope we will go smoothly through the summer towards the end of 2016. At the same time, we should be discussing long-term issues and challenges, how to do these important short-term fixes while helping the countries to really address the bottom line issues, which are domestic grown, which are good governance, rule of law, autocrats. Florian has a very nice saying that I think it's illusion to support autocrats providing stability, which it delivers you on Kosovo. That's fine, because these autocrats in their mindset, they need confrontation and polarization and conflicts around them to stay in power. So short term you are fixing things, long term you are spelling out more strategic challenge. And my last issue is Russia. Because of quiet walking out by Europeans and Americans from being heavily engaged, let's say 10 years ago, the doors is open up to Russians and other unwanted influences who are spoilers, who really invest a little bit. It's not their direct neighborhood of sphere of influence, but they can spell trouble so that they distract Europeans and Americans. And if we allow that trouble to grow, we'll be much more distracted. We'll have to spend much more diplomatic or other capacities and resources down the road. So our message in a nutshell, pay attention now, do the right fixes. It doesn't take much, so that you avoid much more heavier or more robust effort down the road which would be needed anyway, because simply this is the soft underbelly of Europe that will send shockwaves through Europe.
So Milan, let me just pick up on this and punt the question to Dimitar, because Milan said three things that are worth calling out. That the likelihood of violence in Europe is not in Ukraine, but perhaps in the Balkans. He mentioned the attempted coup, almost successful coup in Montenegro. And I think you said on the verge of civil war in Macedonia. So if you open the papers, North Korea, Twitter, we've got big crises, big issues that are out there. Is Milan being hyperbolic? I mean, these are pretty serious words to say when this is not a driving narrative of how Washington is even thinking about this region. And Dimitar, are your colleagues being hyperbolic on this?
I think I should turn the question around and say that, I mean, of course, you're right at a certain level. North Korea is a menace. What happens in Iran is a huge challenge. And of course, there's China. But then again, thinking about the Balkans, it's a low-hanging fruit. Much has been invested, and investment has paid back. I think everybody would agree on this one. The kind of region we had in the 90s is not there anymore. The risk is that we'll lose all this investment by the EU, but even more importantly here, by the US as well. And it doesn't take much to keep things going. I might disagree on some of the claims the report puts. And there is marginal improvement in areas like judicial reform, in Syria, in Serbia. If you see the Freedom House reports and other indices, you see marginal improvement. The big picture is dire, but there are green shoots. Civil society will be the other area. So it takes much effort, and it's a painstaking job to reform a country, and much has been achieved. That now is at risk for a variety of reasons. And it doesn't take a huge amount of resources and political commitment to keep things on track. That's the message. There are a number of spoilers. It's much easier to break than to make in this region. And there are other powers, notably Russia, which is the subject of the book I just wrote, and it's about to be published.
Did you say it's much easier to make than to break, or much easier to break than to make?
My Freudian slip. It's much easier to break what has been achieved, to backtrack on democracy than to build functional judiciaries, to have a healthy media environment. Spoiling is an easier game than constructing. And EU and the US have been in the business of constructing. I think the job is 50, 60% there. It's just the remaining 40% that remains to be done. It might be a decade or two, but clearly now we are fighting a rearguard battle just to consolidate what we have. So I don't think you are off the mark when you say you have other challenges, but let's think about the achievements and how to prop up what we have already.
I'm going to come back and question or challenge that premise, but Dimitar does have a book coming out pretty quick soon on Russia's role in the Balkans.
Yeah,
and so you've
pick
got.
up the flyers.
All right, fantastic. What's the name of the book? Yes.
Rival Power, Russia in Southeast Europe.
Rival Power. But look, you've made the case about the weakness of reforms and domestic governance, but there's also a lot. You're publishing a book on Russia and the Balkans. Unpack this a little bit, and is the breaking what we're seeing? How much of this factor are we seeing as a problem indigenous to the region, and how much of this is the role of external forces, particularly Russia in particular?
Well, very often people in my trades have those fancy phrases, and one of those fancy phrases is Putinization, that Russia is exporting its model of corrupt governance and authoritarianism. I don't think that's how it works, frankly. I think many of the problems are indigenous to the region. Authoritarian trends, the lack of accountability, the weakness of civil society have been there before. And what Russia is doing is to profit from internal difficulties. Not to invest much resources, not to commit to the region, not to have an alternative project. It's not clearly the case. I mean, Russia gave up on its external empire a long time ago under Gorbachev, and Yugoslavia was never part of it. But what Russia can do is just capitalize on all the backsliding, find willing proxies, and it's a double game, of course. It's also the tail wagging the dog. You have X number of politicians, political parties, civil society actors, even clerics and business people who are willing to play the Russian card to advance their goals. And Russia can use them to put a spanner in the works of the West. That's the big game in Russia. The logic in the minds of many in the Kremlin is, look, we have Western powers, the US and the EU, stirring trouble in our backyard. Georgia is ours, Ukraine is ours, Moldova is ours. And because they are pushing us, we can reciprocate. And Montenegro is a tit for tat for the Caucasus and so on and so forth. As long as you maintain pressure in a weak spot, in the soft underbelly, if you will, of the West, then you can create some positive momentum to advance your interests. And that's your stick. It doesn't take much to deploy it. It doesn't take troops or putting your prestige on the line as in Crimea or on Eastern Ukraine, but still you get some mileage out of it. That's how it looks in the Kremlin.
So before I come back to you, Maida, I want to come back to Florian because you mentioned the return of geopolitics to the region, and there's obviously a rich history of geopolitics in the Western Balkans. But play that out a little bit in terms of how much you see really the role of Russia and where that is instrumental in some of the crises versus being exaggerated, but also the return of geopolitics. I think you've included Turkey in that. We're here in Washington with President Erdogan just right over there, speaking to a few other Atlantic Council board members at this time, and we just had Sergei Lavrov in town. So unpack the geopolitics part of this to help us understand what you mean by the dynamic we see today in the Balkans.
Yeah, when we say bringing geopolitics back in, it's not just the spoilers, but it's also the way in which maybe the United States as well as the European Union or some of its member states have been looking at the Balkans. So kind of favoring stability over democracy. So that you know, if you're bringing back geopolitics, it's kind of you're saying, well, we don't really care about what kind of government we have as long as they offer us some kind of stability. And we know we use the term stabilitocracy. I mean, kind of regimes which are based on stability and which are supported for being stable rather than being democratic in the region. So I think that we've seen this with the migration crisis, for example, that at some point it was more important for EU member states, for some EU member states to close the borders, and Macedonia played an important role in that, than how the government would act domestically. And that's what I mean, or what we mean when we talk about geopolitics. It's not just about Russia getting more engaged, and I think Dimitar summarized it very well in saying, you know, it's a low-hanging fruit, it's an easy target, and Russia is taking what it can in the absence of a strong Western engagement. And that Western engagement very often is, again, thinking through the lens of geopolitics rather than through the lens of, you know, the EU thinking and also the US thinking has been these countries will be members of the European Union, thus they will be like us in the club based on the same standards, right? And what we kind of observe now with the kind of enlargement becoming a more long-term process is that there's a favor for, they keep it quiet, they make progress on these larger questions, Serbia, Kosovo, but what they do domestically when it comes to freedom of media, when it comes to you know, kind of the state of the opposition, the rule of law, we turn a blind eye on it because they deliver. And that, of course, then these regimes invite Turkey or the Emirates or China or other investors. So a lot of that influence doesn't have to be malignant, right? So it can be also benign as long as it's transparent. So I think what we see in a lot of countries, like in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but also in Serbia, a lot of investment coming from the Gulf, for example, there's nothing problematic about it, you know, in its kind of certain way if it's managed transparently. But what we're seeing is a lot of it flows into party coffers, it's very intransparent, and it's used to shore up governments or parties which are quite autocratic. So that's, in a certain way, the kind of less positive role external actors can play. They could play, you know, they can be very constructive investors, they can, you know, bring the economy forward, but the way it's going on at the moment is rather playing into the hands of local autocrats.
So let me bring this to Maida, because to have geopolitics, the game that's playing out on the ground, you know, it might actually be the fact that the most senior political figures in the United States and perhaps even in Europe actually don't have an awareness that they're playing geopolitics because it's not part of their radar screen in the region. Milan said this is a post-war region. Maida has the experience of having lived in Sarajevo in Bosnia in difficult times, but also being German and having lived in Germany. And if you think about Germany 20 years after World War II, I'm not sure we walked around calling it a post-war region. And so let me just, back to the premise of our whole conversation, I think Dimitar said that this investment you know, may have paid off. But in some of our Chatham House Rules conversations, we've heard other officials joke that perhaps there's a big difference between investment and sunk costs. So we did a lot in this region. It's 20 years on, and look where we are as we're prioritizing how from sitting in Washington or Berlin should we think about the sense of a continued need of investment when we look at whether there's really been a return on that investment in this region after 20 years.
Thanks, Damon. Before I kind of get to that point, let me just follow up on one point that Florian has made. And I think it's very interesting that the debate about Balkans in a way makes me think of a theme that was dominating discussions on the Middle East and North Africa in the wake of the Arab Spring, when European Union was often accused of supporting autocrats and dictatorial regimes in exchange for stability and control over the flow of migrants in the region. And so one thing that Damon didn't mention is I also just moved to Washington after having lived in Saudi Arabia for 2 years. And when I think of both Balkans and the region of Middle East and North Africa, I have a slightly schizophrenic reaction, where on one side, I feel that in comparison to what we're facing in that region, the Balkans is still a piece of cake to manage. Most of the countries in the Balkans have very small, relatively speaking, and relatively well-educated population, very Western-oriented, pro-European. If you look at the most recent survey by the International Republican Institute, you will find that the overwhelming sympathies among Muslim population in the Balkans lay with the United States and Europe. And that is something that you will not easily find in many of the countries in the Middle East, if surveyed. And so, while on one hand I'm optimistic, I think you would have, if you could somehow remove, right, part of this parasitic structure, which feeds on exacerbating divisions, but also feeds on public funds, I think you would have some great resources to manage, and investment would be worthwhile. So while on one hand I'm optimistic, on the other, my optimism sometimes kind of gets overtaken by dread thinking of the Middle East and North Africa as a fast forward to where Balkans could get to if some of the fundamentals are not properly managed. But just to kind of round up a little bit of what has been discussed, I really think that we ought to be realistic about how much outside help we can actually expect, and ask ourselves two basic questions. One is, how much importance is attached to the Balkans in the EU and US capitals, realistically speaking? And two, how much are the Western leaders willing to invest in political terms? How deep and long is the attention span of the decision makers? And I think the answer to these two questions does not necessarily have to be the same. There might be issues of interest, yet no concept, vision, or idea of how to address some of these difficult issues. And so what ends up happening is that the approach is very often short-termist, because it is informed by political priorities and political debates at home. And so if you take refugee crisis, for example, let's just look at that, which has been one of the issues that has certainly kind of driven the point home in Europe that Western Balkans is worth investment. Because it reminded them how closely tied it is and how easily the spillovers are felt in Europe. Whether you're talking about refugees or whether you're talking about export of organized crime or export of foreign fighters. And so, although there is an acknowledgement in the capitals of Europe that, you know, we really need to invest and strengthen the resilience of the institutions and societies in Western Balkans, at the same time, the response is shaped by the internal dynamics in the member states, something that Milan has already mentioned, where also we have to look what's happening within the EU, where the liberal consensus about human rights, open borders, shared sovereignty is under attack by the right-wing parties. And so the number one priority then in the capitals becomes, you know, shaped by the electoral debates. Naturally, how do you stop the flow of the refugees? And in that respect, some of the Balkan countries have been doing a great job, some really constructively, others, you know, putting up fences and creating such miserable conditions for refugees that you discourage further inflow. And I'm digressing a little bit from your question, but I think it's really important to think about external engagement in the Balkans to really kind of understand how some of these mechanisms function. So there's much less coverage nowadays on migrant crisis, right? You have a feeling that the refugee flow has stopped. The borders are under control, but is that really the case? And in fact, it's not, because smuggler networks are now doing the job. and have overtaken the control of the refugees going through the Balkan. And you have a very vibrant smuggler route, which is going through Kosovo, Bosnia, Albania, where much of the smuggling is taking place jointly in cooperation with the political elites that claim to be partners of the EU. And so I think understanding some of these, the opportunity structures and interests and motives of the political players that pose as the partners is crucial before making any further decisions on investment.
So let me ask the delegation. I mean, there's an EU incentive to work with the region to help manage and stop the refugee flows, a very self-interested aspect. But part of the whole recipe had been the prospect of the Thessaloniki vision, the prospect of eventual integration into Europe was essentially seen as that was the incentive to actually get the reforms done, to, in some respects, positively coerce local leaders to take some tough decisions. And yet, with the clarity of Juncker articulating a hiatus and enlargement, is that formula even viable, or is there a whole new recipe that needs to be developed at the core of the strategy in terms of how does the actual EU have lever in this region?
I mean, I would say that, first of all, the original idea was I think a workable one. What is lacking is, first of all, the prospect of an end. And at the moment, because of this, the statement by Juncker and the larger atmosphere in the European Union, the sense is this process is going to drag out for a long period of time. We have a kind of looming French threat of a referendum for any further enlargement. So it's unclear, or similarly in the Netherlands, so we don't know whether enlargement will actually happen and when it will happen. And that, of course, immediately deflated the kind of transformative power of that whole process. So if that comes back on track with the conclusion of the election cycle this year, and hopefully the further confirmation that far-right populist politicians fail to win elections, that would then allow the European Union to focus again on its core mission and complete enlargement. Now, there is a structural problem with that. It's also that the enlargement was always premised on the idea that the people who join want to join because they're committed to the values. And in many countries of the Western Balkans, citizens are interested, they're committed to it, but the political leaders are not necessarily. So they're very good at faking it. So what we get is that the European process assumes the good intent of the leadership in reforming. But in the region, we get a lot of leaders who are putting up Potemkin's institutions, which look great on paper, but everybody who knows them knows that behind the scene, it goes, the ruling happens in a very different way. And so the EU is very good with kind of counting laws and counting institutions, and not very good with looking behind the scenes. And so, sometimes I'd say that we have, the EU confuses the forest for the trees. It says, how many trees have you planted, but does it make a forest? Does it make a forest of a liberal, vibrant democracy? And that's something which I think the EU needs to look hard of understanding, that it's not just the sum of the institutions. It's encouraging, which is, of course, one of the prerequisites, but there's more to it.
But let me just bring in your colleagues, and I do want to turn to the audience soon. But if you're a political leader in the region, it doesn't take a lot to figure out that everything, the ultimate prize that the EU is offering, is something that's beyond your political cycle. It's beyond your electoral cycle. And so, again, that leverage, how does that play back in terms of the prospect for reform for Milan and Demi, and then we'll come to the audience.
Damon, let's come back to your case of Montenegro. So Montenegro is in the EU enlargement process is an accession country, so it started negotiating about its membership. But the prospect of actually coming to an end of that process is what, in the best case scenario, 8 or 9 years. This is where NATO perspective was much more tangible. So it took Montenegro many years to get to the point of becoming a member, and they had to fulfill all the action plans and so on and so on. But at the end, it was faster process. It was also a low-hanging fruit for NATO allies to stabilize. By taking the country in, it achieved, I think, stabilization of another piece of the Western Balkan. And in the end, it was a larger case than just a small country of Montenegro. It was about the case of actually delivering on the promise And on the US side of leaving the allies behind, or actually finishing the job and sending a signal to the region. And that was really, I think it was well done. There was a lot of nervousness and uncertainty in the region about when the Senate will pass the decision ratification and so on. It was really followed on the front pages, not only in Montenegro. I got phone calls from Sarajevo, from Belgrade, even, and Serbia is the only country that doesn't want to be a member of NATO. But for them, they're quietly saying, we want Montenegro to be in because that is a stabilizer. Also, Serbia needs NATO and Kosovo to protect the Serbian minority. So it's no longer, we are in the era where things are not easy, not anymore. Picture is very complex, but if you make a mistake or if you mismanage or if you don't pay attention and don't manage this post-conflict region, it can boil out. And now something about the EU. Just briefly, yeah. EU is structurally limited now and very fragmented to deliver some things. You have to look at member states. Take the case of Macedonia, which is at a really tipping point now. The case is bigger than Macedonia. It's about whether you can have a transfer of power and peaceful transfer of power, or whether it will involve bloodshed, because you have a new majority in the parliament. For the first time in the whole post-conflict enlargement story in the Balkans. What the EU is doing, they send the enlargement commissioner, because they say that, okay, in Macedonia, Federica Mogherini, the high representative foreign policy, it's not her mandate. Because Macedonia is part of the enlargement story, so the commission takes care. So they don't have a strongman. They don't have Javier Solana anymore after the Lisbon Treaty 2018. So who is next? The member states. And if the EU credibility in the region is destroyed or not there, then only Germany can build it around. And with whom? With some member states, but also with the US. This would not work without the US, because you have at least two important elements, critical elements that Europeans don't have. You have hard power and military, and you have also your geopolitical and geopolitical drive and strategic thinking to keep, let's say, some unwanted influences out.
Did you want a brief comment, and then I'll turn to
Yeah, I want to take issue with something you said, that the payoff is in the future. It's not. And that's the problem. The Balkans are already in the EU. They trade freely. There is no visa regime. For all intents and purposes, they are already part of the whole EU constellation. But that's a real problem, because for many people, if you're dissatisfied with the status quo, you just choose exit. You go to Germany. You emigrate. You don't want to change Sarajevo. You don't want to have say. I mean, Nikola is a great person who can make a difference in Macedonia, but he's in The Hague, not in Scheveningen and in the center of The Hague. And that's the essence of the problem, that the Balkans are integrated, but it doesn't do you any good in consolidating democracy. Second thing, because they're consolidated, Balkan policymakers or leaders have managed to forge common causes with the unsavory characters in the EU. Think about the refugee crisis. It was a solution imposed through common action with Orban and with the Austrians. It was not a Brussels solution. It was Merkel, and then Gruevski, Vucic, plus Orban having a unilateral response. And Austrians, yeah. So that's the kind of Europe we are getting. I won't say much more than that. Thirdly, and that's my last comment, where the US can weigh in is all those blind spots that EU doesn't tackle. One, media. Huge decline in quality of media over time. EU hasn't done much. And the second one is the reform of the whole security apparatus. EU enlargement doesn't do any good how you control secret services, how you control the Ministry of Interior. And these are the tools that all those strongmen deploy in controlling opposition and clamping down on dissent.
Let me just ask if there are some comments, questions from the audience. I want to get into foreign fighters and some other issues, but want to give an opportunity for folks to come in. Let me turn first to this woman here. Please use a microphone for our online audience and introduce yourself and ask question, please.
Sure. Amanda Brown with Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck. You made a very credible case for U.S. engagement in the Balkans and why it is a credible partner. But Maida, you brought us back to the reality of what's likely to be a short-term, election-driven response. So I'm curious, and you started to touch on it, Dimitar, what would be the most effective short-term response that the U.S. could take for stabilizing, or doing more than stabilizing the Balkans?
And I think there was a colleague, this gentleman here, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is George Milosevic. 2 years ago, I came here to start a grad school, recently finished. And I would just tell a little bit about my perception of youth from the countries where I'm coming from and the region. I think that the young people in the Balkans are losing their beliefs in the ideals that are actually and the values of the European Union. Mostly, and I asked myself, why is that happening actually? And then the examples are coming from for example, Montenegro. You have a country that's for more than 25 years, there's one single prime minister and president and the ruler who is actually being successful. And it seems to me that young people don't see any more ideals in democracy. It seems that who is making the best progress in the Balkans, it's the autocrat. And he, to a certain extent, became a role model to everybody else. You know, everybody else in the region see that Montenegro is making the best progress. It's getting into the NATO. It's the closest member to become the EU. And my question is, how is EU and Washington is going to address that so the young people don't lose faith in future? Thank you very much.
We'll come up to the front to the ambassador, please.
Thanks. Thank you so much. 3 points on Macedonia. I won't really tell the whole story. It will take too long.
Thank you.
One, it's one of the most clear examples of what happens when European and Euro-Atlantic integration is off the table. And this is what Macedonia faced after the Bucharest summit in 2008. Macedonia was the first Balkan country that signed the Association and Stabilization Agreement in 2001. It was part of the Vilnius Group. It was part of the Adriatic Charter. It is still out. I'm not saying that this justifies what we see, the sad state of democracy we see today, where peaceful transition of power is made so difficult, where MAP was allowed to enter parliament and bloodied the face of the leader of the Social Democrats, potentially the next prime minister, Zoran Zaev. So I think there is a big lesson learned in the light of what you discussed here. Let's say the skeptical EU member states losing faith in the transformative power of enlargement, that it actually makes a difference. This is what the risks are. And I think the second lesson from Macedonia is, because of the wiretap affair, the wrongdoing and the democratic shortcoming is so visible and exposed. And if we are not able to bring the government to account, when this is so in the open, this will be a horrible message to the rest of the region. And my third point is, as you well know, Damon, you were part of the team of Lord Robertson. Macedonia was the biggest success story of EU-NATO cooperation in those days. Conflict prevention, averting a civil war in 2001, Solana and Lord Robertson. Both EU and NATO risk Macedonia to turn from their biggest success in the region to basically a very shameful nightmare of today. And very last line, I think we need the endorsement that the post-Yugoslav order in the Balkans stands, both from Washington and from the EU, that borders are not to be touched, and that the perspective is still there. And two, I think we need more honesty on the red lines of the biggest fundamentals of having a liberal democratic society governed by the rule of law. Freedom of the media and rule of law and checks and balances are not to be touched. And both Washington and the EU should not shy away from calling a foul play when those lines are crossed. Thank you.
So let me just bring this back to the audience. I'll come back back to the panel. The quick thing on the short-term U.S. steps, and then comments on Montenegro and Macedonia, but they really speak to the issue of how much do you need targeted country-specific efforts. We haven't even talked about Bosnia, versus what you were ending with, sort of principles for the region. Don't pick up all of those, but pick up on a couple elements of those.
Do you mind if
Please start, Maida. Start.
And I think the last point that you've just made, in fact, is precisely the answer to both of your questions, because I think they're quite related. And if you ask me, if I, I think, can everyone hear me, or do I need a microphone? Sorry. So if you look at the example of Bosnia, and to follow up on your point, setting red lines, and showing something that hasn't been shown in the last 10 years, and that is determination to react and sanction the behavior, not necessarily by official sanctions. I think that would already be a good starting point. And I think we have to understand that what we have today, take Bosnia as an example, is not a result of efforts having been put, without any results for 10 years, but signals that were being sent that everything will be tolerated. One example from Republika Srpska, which is known as the most kind of problematic element in Bosnia, of the obstruction of state institutions. You have a couple of major state institutions that were supported and set up with great help of the US and the EU, which have mandate in not just kind of the justice and prosecution, but have mandate in counterterrorism, which is very important for the US interests. And so one of the key institutions that is responsible for counterterrorism is also responsible for war crimes and corruption, which is why it has been under attack by Milorad Dodik and the RS leadership for the past 10 years, unsanctioned. January 2016, there was an incident, in which I won't go into detail, where the RS leadership has declared that this institution has no longer access to the territory of the RS. So this is practically like Governor of Georgia saying that FBI cannot operate on its territory. And just an example of how this one instance of united reaction by the representatives of international community without sanctions was enough for Dodik to withdraw this. And I think we really have to understand that there has been simply too much tolerance and not enough reaction to some of these rhetorics and obstruction of the institutions.
Other quick steps the United States could take are also country versus regional strategy.
I mean, I think, first of all, I think what we need at the moment is clarity of commitment. I think this is, at the moment, we're kind of in a moment when there is no clarity in the region that the US remains committed to the same kind of policies it's been pursuing in the Balkans for the last 25 years. So kind of making it very clear that the policy pillars of keeping the post-war order in place, commitment to liberal democratic reforms and rule of law in the region, and the EU prospect for the countries, that remains in place. That commitment already would go a long way to avert a certain kind of vacuum which we're seeing in the region right now, where a lot of political forces are kind of seeing the uncertainty as an opportunity to challenge the status quo. So that would be the first kind of message, is get back on message and stick to the message the US has been administration over the last 25 years been pursuing, And then we have to talk about what goes beyond that. And there I would agree very much with Maida, is like establish more red lines, make them clear, public, and saying if you cross them, there are consequences. Sanctions for Dodik, for example, is one example, and I think one should talk more open about sanctions and other kind of clear penalties. And the US is in a better position to impose them than the European Union is. So if there's a kind of a clear coordination between the US and the EU of the one side has the sticks, the other one has the carrots, and that they are coordinated, that
Very briefly on, I think Macedonia is now very much on the spot. So build on the successive case of Montenegro, where the State Department and Senate really done, and the Atlantic Council here and think tanks did a splendid job after some hesitation at the beginning. And don't be afraid to use some sticks. If President Ivanov doesn't deliver by the end of the week, have some plan and talk to Berlin and other EU capitals and be coordinated. Don't lose, this is slippery slope, don't lose this, your eye should be on the ball now.
Yeah, I mean, just to second this one, stick to the Macedonian leadership, balance with negotiations with the Albanian side to soften down their rhetoric. Maybe restart the NATO accession process for Macedonia, that would be very helpful. Not to forget this one.
I want to bring in another round. We've got about 10 minutes. I'll come over this side. Let me start with Ambassador Gelbard, and I'm not sure what you want to address, but I'd like to put in the front of your question, Ambassador, this is someone who worked in the Balkans and who has a reputation in the Balkans of not just talking, but getting things done in the region, and no doubt brings clarity on many of these issues. Given your experiences of having worked so many issues there, what is your reaction to this conversation, but importantly, the U.S. posture and role at this time?
Thank you. Speaking as a former policymaker at a critical time, and I became President Clinton's special representative for the Balkans after Holbrooke and through the end of the Kosovo War. First, getting back to the issues of stability versus reform, I think that's a false choice. And we shouldn't aggregate the countries, because the countries are in very different situations and have to be dealt with very separately. But I think an overriding issue has been the, and I'm going to exaggerate to make a point, has been the passivity of the United States over the last two American administrations. There have only been a few bright moments over these last 16 years when the United States has shown leadership. And the converse of that, of course, is that a sad lesson I learned, and I hate to say this because I'll probably antagonize most people in the room, is that the term European leadership tends to be something like an oxymoron. I think many of us will recall, it was either 91 or 92 when Jacques Post of Luxembourg said, "This is the hour of Europe." Well, it wasn't. And what I see these days, both from Washington and in my travels throughout the Balkans, is that for the most part, and on the important geopolitical and reform elements, is that there has not been European leadership. There has not been EU leadership. There has not been any leadership. And I'm sure that leaves me open to criticism and explanations of a lot of incidents and moments when there has been. But recently I was in Macedonia, and I had a long evening with Zoran Zaev, who is a friend. And I was startled, of course, to see how things have devolved in Macedonia. And I don't know if this was coincidence, the United States, in the person of Hoyt Yi, finally showed some leadership. And after President Ivanov said he wouldn't meet with him, he did meet with him, and suddenly there was a new parliamentary speaker. Now, perhaps these were coincidences. And we'll see what does happen over the course of this week, but I've been hearing that Zaev might well become the prime minister later this week. We will see. But in other places, I think US leadership goes a long way for a variety of reasons. And we haven't seen it in a long time. And I think that there has to be a better understanding within the United States government that the Balkans does matter whether we like it or not, and nobody else is going to fill that vacuum. I could go on, but I won't.
Thank you, Bob. We don't have that much time left, a few hands, so let's get the mic over here and collect a couple of, and if I could ask you to introduce yourself and be very brief so I can pick up the remaining comments and we'll come back to the end on time.
Rauf Bajrovic from Sarajevo, as many of you know here. I have a comment, which is that the panel is really great. I think it's really an excellent panel, and I think all the speakers were really fascinating. I rarely hear things that I didn't think about previously in terms of the Balkans. And I have a question for Maida, whom I don't know, actually, I think very well. What will happen once people in the Balkans who make decisions realize that there's really no EU prospect for the region? Because my view, having spent some time in the Balkans in the last few years, of course, is that really the prospect does not exist. When Slovenia was leaving Yugoslavia, there was the famous scene in Yugoslav television where JNA soldiers said, oni bi kao da se ocijepe, mi bi kao da im ne damo. They would allegedly like to secede and were pretending that we're trying to stop them from seceding. Well, that's what's really happening in the Balkans the last few years, in my view. And I'd like you to answer the role of Germany, because my perception, and I really want to be wrong, is that the CDU governments in the last 12 years never really wanted the rest of the Balkans to be in the EU. I think Croatia was the last one to be in. So what is the alternative scenario if there's no EU prospect?
Thank you. Meadow, I'm going to ask you to be a little bit more brief than our colleagues so we can get everyone in.
I have an E issue, so I'll sit. Meto Koloski with the United Macedonian Diaspora, and I'll just add on to both ambassadors. I think the lack of U.S. leadership in Macedonia has been one of the top reasons for the rise of anti-American sentiment, as well as leaving the door open to Russian actors. And there's definitely an increase of Russian influence, particularly in their embassy, doubling their embassy staff. More and more statements by the Russian foreign minister in the last 3 years, as opposed to in the last 25 years, where probably 1 or 2. But there is a U.S.-Macedonia strategic partnership agreement. It calls for a unitary territorial integrity of Macedonia. It recognizes this. And it would be fantastic. It's unfortunate that we haven't seen many working groups of this declaration or strategic partnership that was signed during the Bush administration. Number 2, when Macedonia had its victory at the International Court of Justice over Greece, the U.S. didn't do as much to leverage that to put more pressure on Greece for the PR win that it was for Macedonia. And then last, there has not been a visit of a U.S. president since '99, Secretary of State since 2003, and a defense secretary since 2007. And so what are your recommendations? How can we really improve this?
Thank you. And brief question, sir, please. And then I'll close with the question in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm a retired OECD official, and I have 2 quick questions. I think Dr. Bieber said the population in the Balkans embraces European values, but the governments are fake and build up a Potemkin village. Why doesn't the election process work in these countries? What hinders it from doing the right thing? And secondly is what I feel is optimism about potential American rule in the Balkans. Now, given what's going on in Washington for the recent weeks, I wonder whether you really believe that that optimism is justified. It doesn't seem human rights and good governance don't seem to be the top priorities of the current US government. And I could go on and on. I just want to say, given the current administration in Washington, wouldn't you be better off by convincing the Europeans that what's happening at their doorsteps deserves more attention and more serious effort, rather than relying on a US administration which doesn't give much hope for doing the right thing in the Balkans?
And let me bring in the last question. I'm going to ask you to be shorter than our 3 other colleagues, if I may.
Hi, I'm Haris Fazliou. I'm a researcher here in DC. By background, I'm Albanian from Macedonia, and hearing the discussion about Macedonia here, I think there's an important element that nobody addressed, that's ethnic tensions, which have been pushed by Prime Minister Gruevski for a long time. We don't hear
EU or US representatives or politicians talk and address those issues, as though it's normal to be anti-Albanian, as though it's normal to discriminate politically, economically. And how can we have guarantee that the next government, whichever party is that's different from Gruevski, is not going to do the same? Because what the international community sends a very dangerous message, not addressing those issues. And one of the ethnic tensions are the most powerful tool that Prime Minister Gruevski has had in his hands. So having ethnic tensions as fragile as they are now, they will create in the future a same Gruevski if it's not done
Thank you. I
correctly.
think we've got a set of diverse views here. We're hitting the witching hour, so I'm going to ask you to respond not to every point, but to a couple of them. The one issue that didn't come up from this audience, but as we're up on Capitol Hill, the one issue that often puts the Balkans in front of our political leaders is the issue of foreign fighters. So I want to close by adding that into the mix, and maybe Maida, I know you've looked at that others. But why don't I start with you, Dimitar, and we'll come down the line, and don't feel compelled to answer or respond to every comment, please. But,
well, just make a general comment which sums up many of the issues. One thing that we have to understand, and that's the experience of the current member states or the new member states, is that the EU membership, whether it's the prospect or the actual membership, is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. All things being equal, you have a Serbia which is member of the EU in 10 years, but it will be a Hungary #2. And that will be the case in Macedonia and elsewhere. And unless there is an indigenous dynamic, pressure for reform, it won't happen. And one of the bright spots in the region are all those protest movements, which we didn't discuss, but maybe that's
one
our
of the
next...
bright spots is what?
The protest movements,
Yeah.
the civic energy that has been unlocked over the past several years. And that's maybe the topic of our next panel here. They complement politics and they have to find a way to influence political decisions, but we're not quite there. But without this indigenous impulse, nothing will happen, and we have the same dynamic reproduced, even within the EU. Just a point of caution to factor in.
Milan, please.
Let me start with Montenegro and Milo Djukanovic. We didn't address it before. Look, now when Montenegro is parked in NATO, there is a possibility to move on and look for alternative. The problem in Montenegro is, show me an alternative where you have current opposition, which is mostly ethnic Serbian, which would, I think, destabilize the region. They take power. So the lack of alternative is a problem in Montenegro also for young people. And I very much hope that there will be an opposition that embraces the independent state, the independent Montenegro, and pro-EU and pro-NATO sort of strategic orientation of the country. And then Milo can go, and I would be the first one to support that. Now, role of Germany. I think it's just exactly the opposite, Reuv, with all due respect. CDU and Angela Merkel is the only one among Western European leaders that has some vision for the region and that wants the Balkans to be enlarged. And its window of opportunity was used by Croatia in 2005, but Macedonia and other countries were on the track. It played out this way, but the amount of time that Angela Merkel and her advisors, starting with Christoph Heusgen and others, spent on Serbia and Bosnia is immense. And the problem for Germany now is they really are preparing to re-engage after the elections at the foreign ministry and at the chancellery, but they need partners and they need US leadership and here I would address what Mr. Gelbart said. It's a different kind of US leadership now. It's leading from behind. And the whole Kosovo-Serbia dialogue that was started in 2013 by Lady Ashton was possible because US was there, but was actually leaving the leadership to others. Brits were part of it, Brits and Germans, and of course Robert Cooper behind Lady Ashton. This is not there. Federica Mogherini is not the right leader, providing the right leadership. And maybe last point here about Trump administration not being credible. The problem is that President Trump created false expectations among the Western Balkan leaders or their cohorts because they expected, okay, now we will be, we'll be allowed to do these things. being harsh on the media, our own media, on the opposition. And strangely enough, what the messages from Washington are, come on, this is not to be tolerated. We want you to keep to your own pledges and promises. And it's the State Department of this administration. And I think it's important to keep that in line, because eventually in the Balkans, this will lead to bloodshed. You have much stronger institutions here. And it's not only about the Balkans. The EU is divided also because there is Hungary inside with its own illiberal agenda.
Terrific.
Sorry. Oh, it was
1 minute, Florian.
Yes, just briefly. The question why people are not voting out the autocrats, and I think it's partly because they're employed by them. I mean, you know, the whole system is based on patronage. People are getting jobs, and if they don't vote, they lose their jobs. And that cycle has to be broken, that basically people are not able to vote independently based on their policy preference, but they are forced to vote because of that's their employment. And that is, I think, one of the key problems across the region. And the only thing I want to really pick up on is Damon's point about foreign fighters, and that I think what we're seeing is the number of foreign fighters at the end of the day was quite minor in the region if we compare it to many West European countries. What we're seeing is that lots of people are extremely frustrated in the region. They don't go to vote. They don't see themselves represented. They don't see a prospect. And there are several options. One is going to the West. That's what most do. The others withdraw from politics, and there are few who radicalize. And I think what we're seeing is also a young generation of people who are radicalizing because they're alienated from religious institutions, and they might become radical nationalists, or they might become religiously radical. That goes in different directions. But I think that they also might become actually, anti-Western, not because they are, intrinsically, in overall, the direction is more in being pro-European, pro-US. But if they're seeing their elites supported by the EU and the US, they're more likely to say, well, if we can achieve change, it's not with them, but it's against them. And I think that is the risk. It's not the foreign fighters, but it's rather the radicalization of not seeing kind of the natural allies supporting their frustrations and trying to help them change the governments in a more democratic way.
Terrific. Thank you. Maida, final word.
How much do I have? 1 minute?
A minute or less.
Less than a minute. So very fast. Rauf, I think that the elite in the Balkans has already realized that the prospect for European integration is, quite weak or not there. And quite frankly, if you talk about the leadership, I'm not even sure that some of these leaders want to go into the EU. Because there they would get a set of institutions and checks and balances that they're trying to get rid of in their own countries, as I'm sure you know. What will happen when the population realizes that is, I think, a bigger question. And what Florian has just said, I think, is the trend that we might see happening. On foreign fighters, I absolutely agree with Florian's point. Let me just take it maybe 10 years down the road. We now have, in comparison to the total of Muslim population, really a minuscule 0.015 population radicalizing violently as foreign fighters, as opposed to 0.04 in France. However, what you see is also this non-violent radicalization where, exponentially large numbers compared to 3 years ago of population are turning to more conservative interpretation of Islam. Now, lots of that is being fed precisely by the factors that Florian is talking about. People previously not being religious, disillusioned with corrupt politicians, state, no prospects, etc. Now, think of what will happen if you allow what has been going on. Just take Bosnia. If you allow the whole state structures to be undermined, you're basically risking having a couple of failed states, not just in Bosnia, but also in Macedonia. And if you have a failed state, then you can bet that the prospect for radicalization is going to be much greater. And I think this is where we need to be thinking is what is going to happen 10 years down the road, not 2, 10 years down the road, if we really do not have these state structures in place that the US has helped put and enable to work properly. in the early 2000s.
Terrific. Thank you very much for those closing thoughts. I'm going to wrap up with just one thought. There's a lot of difficult stories, negative news, challenges from the region, but I think what's obvious to all of you and many of our audience watching online is that one of the things that is quite remarkable about the region is the human capital, the potential of the people. We took a group of young innovators, our fellows, a whole group of fellows to the region who knew very little about the region, but for the express view of how to actually create relationships with incredibly successful rising leaders and their peers in the region. There is a hunger, there is a thirst, there is a compelling human capital, and yet the systems are failing them. And so how do you actually work both in the region, but through our policy structures to affect the incentive structures, to create alternatives to some of the patronage structures? How do you have opportunities for jobs, for growth, for success at home that keeps some of those folks and some of you in this room invested in your home countries? And for the United States, you know, I take Ambassador Gelbart's point to heart. One of our audience members was questioning it. But part of what we've been trying to do here at the Atlantic Council is, regardless of an election cycle or the vagaries of what's happening in our politics, how we meticulously cultivate a bipartisan sense of understanding of what's happening, what's at stake, the U.S. role, and a sense of a basis for a sustainable element of policy. This doesn't have to be President Trump or any president's top priority at this point. But if you think about the alliances we've built from McCain and Senator Murphy and Senator Shaheen and Senator Johnson, a group of folks and many others up on Capitol Hill, and as we see people emerge in the administration, we need some coherence, but we don't need this to be the top priority out of the White House. And I think what we see is, in the absence of that, is where we're inviting problems that will force those that don't want to deal with this to actually have to spend more time on this issue. And at the Council, in our own way, we're trying to do our own part through our work on the Balkans to help generate and support a crop of new policy leaders, business leaders, and analysts that do bring, weren't just forged through the times of the Balkan Wars, but are coming to this anew with fresh perspectives and insights as part of our contribution to civil society to this debate. That's why we're delighted to partner with the fund for this event and to welcome you and your team here to Washington, and welcome a little bit of European encouraging of Washington to have an understanding, first of all, what's happening in the region, the stakes that it has for our interest, and the sense that we are actually able to play some role in helping to support a better future. So with that, let me thank all of you for being with us tonight. Invite you to stick around for a few moments to spend time with your colleagues and be back for our next Balkan program when that shows up. But the next round will be a couple of rounds of Senate testimony, House testimony. The issue is getting back on the agenda here in Washington. So thank you very much.